Good afternoon, Dr. Bibek. Welcome to Network Capital. We're here today to talk about your career, the role of mentors, and also, most excitingly, your book that has been released recently. So let's start with your career. So could you describe what the role of planning in your career? Has it been a planned one? Or have circumstances and interests and passions defined where you are today?
No, I think the answer to that is very simple, and it's not a very palatable answer, which is that at various points as I look back now, destiny has taken a hand. So everything that I planned for never materialized. To date, every job that I wanted, I did not get. And every job that I got, I did not want in the first place. So now, after several years, I've come to the conviction that there is no point planning. Destiny just takes over.
Thank you. Let's talk about the role of mentors in your life. I mean, you have a rich, very successful professional life. I'm sure you have some mentors. Did you choose them? Did they happen to you? Or how have you maintained the relationships?
Actually, contrary to what you might think, I've had very few mentors. And the reason for that is I think most people who were in positions of being superiors have found me very difficult to handle as a subordinate. So sooner or later there was friction, and to date I have not been able to find a single person other than teachers who taught you as students. I have not been able to think of a single person who's been able to handle me as a subordinate, which probably is part of the reason why I have not lasted in any particular place for a very long time. So far as mentors are concerned, I think the answer is no. So far as the professional life is concerned, yes, I've studied in very good places, and therefore I've had very good teachers.
Thank you. Let's move on and change gears to your book. So tell me how this book happened and how did it evolve into the shape and form it is?
There was a committee that was set up by the present government to examine the restructuring of the Indian Railways. This committee was chaired by me. The secretary to this committee was a gentleman from the Railways. His name is Sanjay Chadda. As a member of that committee, we had Gurcharan Das. I also happened to be a member of Niti Aayog, and there was a young professional in Niti Aayog at that time by the name of Vidya Krishnamurti. So all of us in various ways began to work on the railways. Gurcharan Das, by the way, is the series editor for a Penguin India series that's a business history kind of series. In the course of talking about the railways, examining the past of the railways, discussing the present and the future of the railways, I became very interested in all kinds of little bits and pieces, anecdotal, if you like, that one picked out about the railways. And then I casually suggested to Gurcharan, how about writing an anecdotal history of the railways? Because you have two kinds of histories of the railways. One, very dry academic tomes which no one wants to read, or alternatively completely coffee table kinds of books brought out by various organs of the Indian Railways. So how about having something in the middle? Gurcharan leapt at the idea. I wrote in Sanjay Chadda, whose name I have mentioned. I wrote in Vidya Krishnamurti, whose name I have mentioned. And we had this book, which is an anecdotal kind of the history of the railways from the beginnings in the 1830s to 1947. We decided to terminate it in 1947, although I have plenty of anecdotes about what happened thereafter.
Actually, those are the most exciting parts of the book and the pictures. So how did you structure it? It's filled with beautiful anecdotes from Phileas Fogg to Baba Bhalku, and then some of the meta-narratives that exist today. So how did you find this picture? How did you find these anecdotes? And was the structure predefined, or did it evolve as the book progressed?
The only thing we were fairly clear about is that the best way to do this, because you could have thought of the chapters either thematically, which was somewhat difficult, or alternatively you could have thought of them chronologically, which is how we eventually decided to do it. But actually, from an editorial point of view, despite I being one of the co-authors, this book is not very well done. Editorially, it falls between two stools because we had two completely conflicting objectives. Objective number one, as I said, was to depict the history of the railways using anecdotes and stories. That's clear enough. But also in the process of digging, we discovered all kinds of nuggets in the nature of documents, various other stuff that deserved to be in the archives but people did not seem to know about. So we had these two conflicting objectives. Do we tell the stories or do we also give the reader the documents? And therefore, editorial, as I said, you will find that the book actually falls between two stools and can legitimately be criticized because some parts of it are rather dry and some parts of that have the interesting anecdotes. Most of the anecdotes we discovered by talking to people who gave us certain leads. Then we dug further, explored further. Vidya, being young, could run around to all the various libraries. There's a treasure trove not only in the National Railway Museum here but in various other museums, and that's how we got the elements that went into the book. So far as the pictures are concerned, the pictures were of very good quality. The series is a cheap series, so therefore if you look at the book, the pictures don't seem to be that fantastic, but actually they are glorious pictures. Several of those, not all, are courtesy the National Railway Museum.
I see. The book actually begins with a quote by Marx. So was Marx wrong about India? What did he say, and how would you put it in perspective?
Well, what I personally find very interesting is not what Marx said, which gets quoted by people all the time, but when he said it. Because as we point out in the book, the date is exceedingly important because Marx wrote it, not published it in book form, but in an essay. He wrote it a few months after the first commercial train journey occurred in India in 1853, which tells us how important that was and also tells us that Marx knew what was going on in a relatively remote part of the world, namely India, and we are talking of course about that first run from Boribandar to Thana. Marx essentially said that when you introduce the railways into a country, you cannot prevent its industrial development. That's the statement in a gist, not exactly the exact words. And there are studies that have been done on what railways have done in other parts of the world. In most countries of the world where railways have made a fairly substantial contribution to growth and GDP, it has fundamentally been freight. The way the railways developed in India historically was that they were fundamentally driven by passenger railways, passenger traffic, less by freight. If you imagine a map of India in front of you, you will find that the resource-rich areas which would have benefited from freight are still somewhat underserved by the railways. So the reason Marx's expectations were not happened in terms of the growth multipliers was because of the excessive dominance of passenger traffic.
One might say that some of the debates then hold true for the debates now. So would you agree with that?
Yes, many of the debates. Remember that when the railways first started to develop in India, there was a parallel debate, a parallel initiative also in Britain. So much of what happened in India, whether it was about the role of the state or about something else, was reflective of the debates that were happening in Britain or England. And some of those debates we still are witnessing even today. Debates about whether the railway should be commercially viable. If they are not commercially viable everywhere, then who bears those costs? What should the right prices be? If the private sector is going to come in, under what terms is the private sector going to come in? Is it going to get a guaranteed rate of return in some sense? What are the revenue sources for the private sector? What should be the regulatory kind of structure? The jargon may be different, but these debates will not really ever go away.
True. And one thing I noticed in your book is that you let the reader make the choice. Like you fill it up with the Gandhian perspective, with the Marxist perspective, some of the debates of today. Let's touch upon investment, for instance. So the people investing in railways were guaranteed 5% over and above plus other benefits. Was it an economic reason, or do you believe that there were other reasons involved in such a uniquely structured financial agreement?
Obviously, there was an economic argument. But more important than the economic argument, and I will come back to the economic argument in a minute, is there was an ideological issue. And what was that ideological issue? The ideological issue was the position you had or the perspective you had vis-a-vis the role of the private sector. When the railways began to be developed, primarily driven by Lord Dalhousie, Lord Dalhousie was quite favorable to the private sector. By the time it came to the end of the 19th century, when the government began to take over the railways, there had been an ideological shift in the pendulum, because the subsequent governor generals were not as kindly disposed towards the private sector as Lord Dalhousie had been. So let us recognize that. Having said that, a guaranteed rate of return is always a bad idea, because it distorts resource allocation. And this is a debate that's pertinent even today.
Right.
At that point, what was also relevant was not just a guaranteed rate of return, but a guaranteed rate of return that was guaranteed against foreign exchange risk. But to come back to the main issue which is pertinent even today, is I am asking the private sector to come in and invest in a project that's going to last for perhaps 25 years. I do not know what the market is going to be like. I do not know what the rate of return is going to be like. So how do I persuade and incentivize the private sector to come in? That is a debate that continues even today. There was a deliberate reason why in the book we are not normative, partly because this ends with 1947, it does not get into what is post 1947, and we were very conscious of the fact that in different capacities we have been part of that railway committee, the government, the committee that had been set up by the government. So we deliberately tried to not take positions in this particular book.
That I found particularly interesting. Let's talk a bit about the dates. So, in your opinion, 1857, World War I and World War II, how did they derail the railways or make towards building a stronger railway network?
1857 was a watershed not only in terms of what actually transpired, but in terms of the way it affected the British. And the British had not expected 1857 at all. And what happened thereafter was not reflected only in the railways, but also in other things. For example, the Societies Registration Act, the law that governs the press, all of these were in the immediate aftermath of 1857. Exactly similarly, there was a debate which we partly discovered, which had happened just after 1857, and some of those debates were about trying to rule India not from places like Calcutta and Delhi, which are easily accessible, but from relatively remote hill stations which would not be that amenable to such kinds of disturbances. So there was a conscious attempt to develop these, and you see those in what are sometimes called the mountain railways.
Right.
We also found it interesting that this reaction to 1857 also influenced the development of some of those stations. And one particular station that we mention is Kanpur, which was built in such a way, constructed in such a way that it could withstand any subsequent movement that would be along the lines of 1857. Now these things obviously are very important from the point of view of history. So far as the First World War is concerned, the First World War, I would say, did nothing major directly for the railways, except that the railways had to play an important part in the war effort, and therefore whether it's in terms of developing the iron and steel industry or in terms of developing railway networks that would cater to the war needs, per se I would not say anything specific should be attached to the First World War purely from the point of view of the railway developments.
You know, we began by discussing your career, your mentors, the role of your mentors in your life, and we discussed some parts of the book. I'd like to end with the role that railways have played in shaping the cultural narrative, not just in India, but the world. So I'll give you 4 words. Now you have to construct what it means to you. The 4 words are Phileas Fogg, Around the World in 80 Days, Rudyard Kipling, and Mahatma Gandhi.
Well, all of them have written about the railways. Again, Around the World in 80 Days, what I find very interesting, and I'm surprised that people don't know much about it, is that as soon as that line had been built from Bombay to Calcutta, someone sitting far away knew that that line had been built, and almost within a few months that story was written. And if people remember, I don't know how many people read that book anymore, but that book is about that section having not been quite completed, which is when they take that elephant ride. So far as Kipling is concerned, 2 kinds of things. Firstly, Kipling wrote extensively about the railways. There are several essays he wrote about Jamalpur and the Jamalpur shed there, not always very positively. And Kipling's own publishing ventures had a lot to do with publishing in the broader perspective of the Indian railways being developed. And of course, Mahatma Gandhi also wrote extensively on traveling by trains. So all 3 names that you have mentioned have some kind of a literary connection to the development of railways.
Great. There's also the caste and class angle, which we'll discover when we meet you next. Thanks very much, Bibek. Appreciate it.